Hello and welcome to Cook with Me. Tonight, we won't be making dinner as such, so apologies on that one if you were expecting dinner. Tonight is all about veggie scrap broth, and this is a very particular skill that I would love for you to acquire because it applies to so many different recipes and healthful benefits, I guess you can say, in your world. So, broth in particular, broth stock, I get lots of questions and there's lots to that. So tonight we're going to discuss all of that, get you hopefully the knowledge and the skills behind why would we bother making a broth at home, how to make it easy, how to make it quick, and also all the other uses you can use for that broth. So that's all going to be built into tonight. Now, the smell-o-vision aspect won't kick in for probably about 6 hours when this is on simmer. But if you're doing it overnight in a slow cooker, then you'll wake up to a house smelling amazing, and then you can have some for breakfast straight away. That's actually probably one of my favorite ways to have this, is to put a little small amount in a shallow saucepan and heat that up to boiling and then crack an egg into it for breakfast. Sometimes I sprinkle in a little bit of seaweed or something a little bit more interesting for breakfast soup and have it like a poached egg breakfast soup with a piece of toast. So that's one of my favorite uses for stock or broth, especially as it's brewing the next morning and waking up to that smell. So if you haven't already got all of your ingredients out, let's dig in your fridge for anything that might be going off slightly but still good quality, no mold. Anything that you know won't get used up in time, even if it's really fresh still. And when I say anything, there are a few subtleties to that. So we're going to discuss what I've got on your recipe a little bit more in detail. So in the meantime, I've got some of the staple foods for the basic recipe set here. And I've also got my container of scraps. Now this is something that I want to go over in a little bit more detail with everyone as you're getting everything out and ready. The basic recipe calls for the onion, the garlic, the fresh herbs or dried herbs, carrot. These are kind of the absolute staples. Now, you might be wondering what this is, and I know it looks a little bit like celery on top. This is actually called celeriac, and it is different to celery. This is not how celery grows, as in we don't just chop that bit off and that's our celery head. They are actually a different vegetable. The reason why I'm using this is because I actually want to make use of this root in a soup. And so I'm going to make use of the tops as if it was celery, but they are a different vegetable. You should be able to find these locally. They are maybe a bit more rare when they're not in season and because they're not as common, but this flavor is absolutely beautiful, the celeriac bulb. And we use that generally mashed in mashed potatoes or mashed on its own with a bit of butter and salt is absolutely delicious, or in soups. So that was a bit of an aside, but basically if you're wondering, this is not where celery comes from. They are a different vegetable. So that's our basic ingredients, and pretty much in any stock or broth that you make, you cannot go wrong when it comes to onions, garlic, carrots. They provide a nice sweet flavor into a broth, and regular celery, or in this case the celeriac tops. So lots to go over here. While you're getting everything out and ready, one of the most important reasons why I would say that you'd like to master the idea of making broth or stock very normal in your world, very easy to access, very simple for you to get your head around and just get a broth happening. The reason behind that is huge, but I guess the emphasis that I want to make tonight is we're not going to go into any detail on bone broths as such, which is maybe something you've heard a little bit more about in the media and on the internet as of late. That's going to be a different topic. So today what we're focusing on is veggie broths for the purpose of preventing waste. So all the waste and all the dollars that I see get thrown out every week in somebody's fridge or house devastates me. And that's not even including the amount of waste that happened at the farm level, at the warehouse level, at the retailer's level, or at any levels in between. So there's a lot of food waste that happens in this world. Now, if we can do our part within our own home to make sure that we're not throwing out tens of dollars worth of food every single week, not only will your pocket be better off, but I think everyone will be. So that's one of the reasons for veggie scrap broth. I want to teach you those skills to save you a bit of money, put that back in your pocket. For some people, they've been able to save enough money that they can actually now afford to spend a little bit extra to get organic produce, even though their bill doesn't increase by any, because they're saving money on all the waste that they were previously throwing out. So it is a very big, important skill in my opinion. The other thing is for the nutritional benefit. So if you were to be throwing out, let's just dig into this one. If you were to be throwing out all of these scraps as such every week, and this is, by the way, only the scraps that have come out of the preparation of one meal. So you can imagine how many meals, if you're using lots of fresh fruits and veggies, which I would hope you can start doing that and incorporating that into your world, then there's going to be, a fair amount of stuff that would have otherwise gotten thrown out. So the biggest thing I want you to take from this is that you've paid for every single gram on this counter. And I'd like for you to at least get the vitamin and mineral contents that we can extracted out of it before it hits the bin. So it's the same principle and the difference between recycling and reusing. Recycling is great, but if it's a single-use recycle, it still involves a lot of resources to do that. But if we can reuse something over and over and over before we recycle it, that's ultimately the best option. So what we're going to do here is basically extract every last little bit of goodness that we can out of these otherwise scraps before they get properly thrown out. Or I'll give you a couple other ideas after for how to use them even further, which is kind of exciting. So I'm going to get you to zoom in back on this one. I want to talk more about the vegetable scraps that we can and can't use. This is probably one of the most important skills. So depending on what kind of broth you're making, if you have a very particular flavor in mind that you're after, then you may not want to just willy-nilly throw anything and everything into a broth. So something like the beetroot stems are going to make the broth darker in color, or a little bit red. So if that doesn't matter to you, then we're going to pop them in. They also will be bringing a lot of iron to the party, which in my opinion is quite exciting. Now I'm going to chop them up just a little bit further because in a broth or a stock, we want to extract as much goodness from the vegetable that we can. So we just give it a little bit more surface area for the liquid to extract it from, basically. It's not a super technical science, but that's definitely, I guess, a way to simplify the broth process and get you the most bang for your buck. I've also got here some bottoms from the cauliflower. Now, we're getting into the green territory here, and as soon as we go green in a broth, we have the potential that it can go a little bit bitter. To prevent that, though, we just have to make sure that A, we don't include too much green, or we just take it out after about 6 hours or so to prevent it from going bitter. It's only when they stay in the broth for too long, or we have too much of it, that you're going to get those bitter flavors. And at the end of the day, it's not such a big deal. Once you do a couple of broths, you will start to figure out how much is too much and which greens do I want to include or not include. Variety is always the key. So keeping in mind, the more variety you're using in your vegetables within your meals, the more variety of scraps you're going to get for your broth. So I've got some unused bit of the leek here. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't otherwise use the green bit of the leek in a recipe, but these were just leftover bits that somehow didn't get included. So I'm going to put them in the broth as well. Then we've got our peels from the organic sweet potatoes. Now, again, not necessarily going to get humongous, crazy benefits from even some of these, but the point is that we are going to extract whatever it can give us, and it's also just a way to get different flavors and different profiles into the broth. I've also got some green bean tops and tails. Now, we do have to make sure that none of them are moldy or harboring anything really nasty, but as long as they've been washed and are dirt-free, we're going to put some green bean tops and tails in there too. Okay. Cabbage. Cabbage is a debated one. Some people will say any member of the brassica family will tend to make it bitter. I would definitely agree with that when it comes to broccoli, especially the stems of broccoli. But cabbage, for the most part, is quite sweet. So I'm actually going to put that one into the broth. In particular, the purple cabbage is quite sweet. Include a little bit of that, not too much, but we can definitely include that. And then I had some shriveled up mushrooms, so they can go in as well. Now, one way to make this easy, this is not meant to be an express effort, as in, I don't want you sitting there just chopping up scraps so that you can make your broth. The idea is that is starting to happen as a general habit within your other cooking days. So let's say, for dinner one night, you're just cutting up carrots and maybe, I don't know, some green beans just to steam on their own. You would only be accumulating maybe the carrot peels, the top and tails, and then the green bean top and tails. But if you keep yourself a container in the fridge, This will last about 3 to 4 days in the fridge of scrap piling, if you will. So provided you can put a stock on within that time, that's great. Otherwise, once it's full, and if you're not able to make broth at that point, we're going to pop it in the freezer, and then we could have put this directly in the crock pot from frozen. So you don't have to worry about using them up within 3 to 4 days. We can just freeze them at the end of that and then make our stock another day when we have enough. So that is probably one of the biggest game changer tricks that I've heard back from my clients in the past is this trick. So it doesn't, any size container, anything that you've got, just something that you can keep your scraps in that we can use in broth later, save you time, save you money, and also give you that extra bit of flavor kick in anything that you're making, which for me is the ultimate. It's more about the flavor than anything else in this case. Okay, so that's how we're going to get organized when it comes to making this something that is so easy to get on the cook, on the boil. Now, if you're not using a slow cooker, it is possible to make a veggie broth or even a fish broth in a large pot on the stove. But it is a little bit trickier because the stove might have to be going for potentially 6 hours or longer. In the case of a quick fish broth, again, that's another story for another day. That one can be quite quick and easy. But when it comes to vegetables, 6 hours is kind of our minimum. The closer you can get to 12 hours on really, really low simmer, the better. Now, that's why the slow cooker is, I guess, the magic bullet when it comes to broth or stock, because you can just set it, forget it, and ideally, if yours has a timer function, then you can set the timer and it'll just turn off to keep warm whenever it's done cooking. So you can even leave the house fairly safely with a slow cooker going if that's your choice. Okay, so what do we do? So we've got the scraps in the bowl first. We're going to see how much volume we can achieve with the scraps that we've got first. Then any supplementation that we want to do with otherwise whole veggies or usable veggies, we can add that in. So I've just got some, like I said in the basic recipe staples, I've just got some carrots, some onion, we're going to put in some garlic and the celery tops. So I've washed the carrots and they are organic, so I'm going to put the lot in the broth. Now again, coming back to the surface area idea, we just want to expose as much surface area as is easy so that we can extract all those goodness into the broth in the easiest way possible. And carrots are also going to bring quite a bit of sweetness, I find, to a broth. So it's quite nice, especially if you're going to be making a soup or anything for the kids. Carrots are a really, really good addition to make. The other thing too is most produce stores, you should be able to find juicing carrots. And normally you can get a big bag of organic juicing carrots for even cheaper than the conventional regular carrot bag. So have a look out for those as well. Next up, we have the onion. Now, there are mixed beliefs on this, but personally, I don't like to put onion skins in my broth, even as a scrap. And the reason for that is that quite often, onions will have mold under the layer. Now, I just so happened to get so lucky that this onion didn't have a layer of mold under it, but I'm sure you've had that experience where just under this layer here, there's a little bit of mold forming. So let's just err on the side of caution, and in general, I don't like to put onion skins in a broth, but I will put the actual proper onion in just to get that extra beautiful flavor. Onion is one of those magic foods in a broth. Now, the other quick question that I tend to get often, and please do continue to type in any questions that you do have on this topic, because I want to make sure that by the time you're done this video, you just feel like stock or broth is the easiest piece of cake. I can't believe I wasn't doing this sooner. I need to just get one on and make it a habit. So one of the most common questions that I get is, what is the difference between a broth and a stock? It's a good question. And it's actually one that's hard to find the answer to exactly. There are different beliefs and different ideas on the difference between a broth and a stock. So to clarify, for the sake of home cooking, you can probably use them interchangeably like I've been doing. But in the, I guess, professional restaurant world or chef world, technically speaking, a broth has more flavor and more of a complete finished element to it than a stock. Broths are also made with the actual meat as opposed to a stock which is made generally with bones. In the case of vegetables only, we would probably call that a broth, and we'd be adding more flavor to it so that we could technically just drink it as is, and it would be a delicious, flavorful broth. Whereas a stock is much more of a basic, neutral building to any other dish. And oftentimes that's the one that's high in the gelatin from using the bones, and from, I guess, any other benefits that you'll get from a bone-based stock. So hopefully that clarifies. For the sake of you at home, broth, stock, let's just use them interchangeably if you'd like. For the simplification of it, a broth has ready-to-eat delicious flavor and is very based on abundant different vegetables and spices, whereas a stock is very basic on mostly just the bone component and a few other little spices along the way. So not a huge reason to differentiate. Okay, let's get some delicious garlic into this broth as well. Now, if they look like very, very good cloves of garlic and there's no sign of mold anywhere, then all we need to do is give them a good crush. We could chop through them really roughly a couple of times, skin and all, and put them in. But if you're worried about any sign of mold or any potential of mold, then we would peel them first. Gotta love the live cooking element as I cry with you on TV. Hopefully you're feeling the same thing on your end and can sympathize with these really strong onions that I've just put in. Okay, so there's our garlic. Oh, I can feel the health benefits already and smell what that's going to be like tomorrow morning. And then I'm going to clear away all of these onion acids. And while I chop up the celeriac tops, I'm actually going to get the water filling into that because our volume is mostly taken up. One thing I will add in quickly though is some stems of rosemary. These are probably one of my favorite flavors to put into a broth or a stock. Excuse me. And we can put the whole lot in. So I'm just going to break them roughly in half here, bend them in half so I can fit them in. They look absolutely beautiful. I do like to keep those near the top though, because if you taste it partway through, or if you're really getting a strong smell of the herbs, then you can easily take them out partway through the cooking process if it gets to be too strong. Okay, so let's pop that one under the filtered water, and we just top it up to the fill line basically, and then we can add any little remaining bits in there after. And while that's filling, I'm just going to chop up this little bit of celeriac tops as if it was celery. Make sure we've got no dirt in any of those little crevices. And then I'm going to add that straight in. Give this a little rinse. All right. And the nice thing about making broth and washing your veggies is you don't have to worry about drying them because they're going into a wet broth anyways. Okay, now notice how when we get up to the leafy bit, we're getting pretty green again. So if you're concerned about it being bitter, again, we keep that towards the top of the crock so that we can take it out if needed. All right, so we're pretty much near that fill line. I'm going to call that good. And all we have left to put in now is the olive oil, the apple cider vinegar, and some salt. And we're good to turn that on. All right, now why do we need olive oil, apple cider vinegar, and salt? Very important ingredients, but don't let it stop you from making the broth if you don't happen to have access to them. So at the end of the day, we're really after the flavor that these vegetables are going to bring, and I guess the resulting amazingness of any dish we're going to use it in after. So don't fret if you haven't got these. Roughly, we want a splash of apple cider vinegar. About that much. I believe I've said 1 tablespoon for you guys. 2 tablespoons approximately of olive oil. Now the reason we want to put in a little bit of olive oil, especially into a vegetable-based broth, is so that we can extract the vitamins A, E, D, and K. Those are the fat-soluble vitamins. So without fat, those vitamins can't come into the solution. So if you're using bone broth, if you're making it with bones, there might be enough fat left on the bones to sort that out. But if not, if you're in doubt, you can add a little bit of olive oil, even a little bit of coconut oil are great additions to bring out those extra vitamins. Now, the salt. Whenever, in any recipe that I use, if I just happen to write salt, please know that I'm talking about either Celtic or Himalayan salt. So what we're looking for is salt that is not perfectly white. It's got a little bit of a gray tinge to it. That's the Celtic salt. Or the Himalayan salt you're maybe more familiar with is the pinkish tinge. Now, there are such a big difference between salts. Just because one's called salt and the other's called salt doesn't make them the same. The main thing that we're after here are the 82 to 84 trace minerals that come with a natural, unstripped, unprocessed salt, such as the Celtic or the Himalayan. As soon as we go into the table salt category, iodized table salt, or even rock salt in most cases, we're talking basic NaCl, sodium chloride. It's been stripped of all those other precious 82 minerals that are in perfect proportion as nature intended them, which means that when they go into our body's able to actually A, recognize what it is, and B, work with it in a very balanced way. The body doesn't know what to do with basically just plain NaCl or iodized NaCl. It sees it as a completely different beast. So very important to know, it's those table salts, it's those processed items that are more responsible for our, I guess, health issues related to cholesterol and all that, whereas a salt that the body can recognize and work with is actually critically needed for functions in the body of even moving toxins around properly and helping the whole body function. If you think about it, what's the first thing they do when you go into hospital? They give you a saline solution drip. So very important. The body does need it. That's how we get electrolytes. That's how things move around the body. Don't be afraid of adding salt to your broth. And keep in mind that that's a lot of liquid that we're going to get out of that. When you buy broth or ready-made stocks in the shops, if you buy the liquids, even the stock cubes, most of them, A, are full of MSG to boost the flavor, but also do check the sodium content. And I would be interested to see if any of them are using, well, I shouldn't say any, but I guess the more conventional ones, I probably would guarantee are using the dodgy salts, not the high quality, more expensive salts. So making your own, such an easy skill, and then you're in control of the quality of the ingredients that go in. We do not need any MSG in your world. All right, now no need to even stir this. Sometimes I give it a little poke around just to kind of even up some of the salt distribution there. But that's it. So the lid goes on. We stick this into the slow cooker. Now, ideally, you've got a big slow cooker. So I've already got one ready here that I'm going to show you in 1 second. We're going to put this one on to low, leave the lid on, set it, and forget it. Now, the reason for that, this is about a 3-liter crock, I believe, and this is about a 6.6-liter crock pot. Unless you're literally just cooking for one, I would probably go with this one because it means you can do the exercise less often and still get as much yield out of your broth or stock, filling it with more as you go. So in terms of efficiency, I would say the bigger one, the better. Completely up to you though. Now, in the professional world, a chef is judged on how clear, crystal clear of a broth that they can produce that's still full of flavor. In my world, I don't really mind what it looks like exactly, unless it's, you know, bright red, and I didn't want bright red. But the point is if you want a really clear broth, don't stir, and when you strain it out, don't press or mash any of the veggies. Just let everything drip down, and that'll give you the clearest possible broth. No stirring. Excuse me. Okay, so what does it look like when we're done? Now, this broth has been cooking overnight, and we have this collection of wonderful smells. I wish you could have this, but you will tomorrow morning. And basically, we've got all of our veggies. Some have sunk, some have risen. We've got sediment down the bottom. This is considered stirring, by the way, so this will create some turbidity or some, I guess, cloudiness within the broth, but that's all right. So just to show you, so this one was a very simple broth. I didn't have a lot of extra scraps on at the time, so I just put in some basic ingredients here. So do not feel like it has to be complicated every time you do it. The idea is that you're using what you've got and you're making the best use of what you've got. All right, so from this step, what do we do now? This can get a little bit messy, so I'll just show you a little bit of a workaround. There's a few extra dishes involved, which is another reason why I like to go big with my effort rather than do this more often. Okay, so bigger the better in this case. So I like to get a big bowl or a big pot, put your strainer into that, and give yourself some room to work. And then depending on how full your crock is, it's sometimes easier to do the first little bit with some tongs. Now, in this case, I don't actually have a lot of big chunky stuff in here, so I'm going to just probably pour this straight in. But the more chunky, I guess, big things you have in there, it's easier to take it out like this first, especially if you're doing it while this is still really, really hot. That can get a little bit scary as everything splashes out. Okay, so you can do this process for a little bit. Get the big stuff out first, and then we can start transferring it. Again, if you're doing it while this is still pretty piping hot, you might want to benefit from getting a heat safe. Please make sure it's heat safe. Vessel such as this, and then it's a lot easier to do this in parts rather than trying to pour that whole thing in. I find the crock pot edges tend to just pour everywhere. They don't pour in a nice fine stream. I don't know about yours. So I like to simplify the process. Okay, so we're straining out all of the spent veggies, or the cooked veggies in this case, and we're going to reserve the broth. And I'm going to still tell you all about the different ways we can use this. I have had some people tell me that their veggie broths in particular, so ones where they're not using bones, you can actually take all these bits and blend them in a blender and add it into homemade dog food. So if that's something that you're doing at home for your very precious canine, then you can add a little bit of extra veggie goodness and mix that in with the meat to make the meat go a bit further, to give them a bit of extra fiber in their diet, or just to make use of your food a little bit further. All right, when we get down to the end, then we can pour the rest out very carefully, handling hot things. Hopefully it doesn't splash everywhere. There we go, last little bit out. Okay. Now, how's everyone going? Are we all caught up? I guess you're not even at this stage yet, so hopefully you're just able to take this all in. Okay, so if we don't want the cloudy broth, we're just going to let that do some gentle draining without any pressing. If you want to squeeze all the liquid out of those, then go for it and press the veggies down now. Might give you a little bit of cloudiness. And interestingly enough, I've been doing quite a bit of research comparing or trying to get some, I guess, scientific data behind broth, behind all the different cultures that have used broth in their world for ages, for centuries. And I guess the remedy effect of a chicken soup when you're sick, and why that's such a universally or culturally common recommendation for healing the common cold. And it is very interesting to see that it's really hard to find a lot of scientific studies on what's actually in that liquid when we're done with the broth, with the making of it. So I guess to simplify my findings, I did find some very interesting research about a gentleman who also wanted to know this and sent off many different samples of stock, broth, bone broths, veggie broths, all this kind of thing to a lab to have all the mineral content analyzed. And it was actually very interesting. I won't give away all the data now. I'll probably save that for a blog post another day. The end of the story is eating the vegetables fresh, best possible way to get all those minerals and vitamins into your body. This, we are doing more about flavor, more about extracting the goodness from the parts that would have otherwise been wasted, so saving the dollar. And surprisingly, when we do get into the bone broth world, the main thing that's actually extracted from the bones is protein, not minerals like a lot of people think. So there is nearly as much protein. So you get about 50 grams per liter of protein in a bone broth, which is fascinating information. Anyways, getting a little bit beyond the point. So in a vegetable broth, we are getting mostly the flavor. We are definitely getting vitamins. Minerals are a bit of a different story. Still some, definitely still trace minerals. And because we added that good quality salt, that's definitely going to be adding electrolytes to our body. So do not discount the value of this for health. It's just maybe not as much of a panacea as many people are making it out to be in terms of, I guess, the levels of minerals in particular that are purported. It's actually much better for so many other reasons than specifically minerals. Okay, so what do we do from here? Once this generally stops steaming and cools down enough, I like to pour it into a large jar and let it refrigerate down to cool. Then we can put it some into the freezer. Once this is refrigerated, it should last about 3 to 4 days in the fridge. Not much longer than that. If we were using meats and bones, then we would get this nice fat layer on top, which would help seal the broth from anything in the fridge, and that could last up to a couple of weeks. But in a vegetable-based broth, we're not going to get that layer on top. So do keep in mind that a veggie broth we want to be using up from the fridge within 3 to 4 days, or we're freezing it either gradually as the freezer can keep up, or freezing it all at once, depending on your container availability. So I want to show you what this, I guess, looks like when we do get it into the freezer. So first of all, the end result. Let's start with the end in mind. I'm coming right back with the frozen options that we have. So personally, I like to freeze the broth in either ice cube trays or cupcake trays. Silicone ones in particular, that is, because they're easier to pop out. So nothing complicated here. We basically freeze them in like that, and then as soon as they're frozen, I'll pop them out, put them into a different container so that they're easy to grab and chuck into soups or my cooking rice or, you know, anything that I want to use that amount of flavor in. And likewise, we can pop these out of their containers quite easily. Whoa! Onto the floor. That's fun. And then we can put them into a container as well. So we'll save those. And the reason why we want to pop them out, a nice low angle, thank you, is so that we can reuse them. So ideally, or I guess probably most commonly, you're going to have excess stock from the fridge, and you might not have enough containers to freeze it all in at once. So when we do this, we can now put another batch in the next day and keep going until you've got everything frozen, basically. If you do freeze it in a large container, a large vessel, especially something like a glass container that we used here, there's a slight risk that it will crack. So make sure that it is a freezer safe or freezable container for one. The other thing is make sure you leave room for expansion. So when water freezes, it will expand, not contract like most other things. It's funny. So high liquid contents, we want to leave room for expansion. If you're freezing in jars, put the lid on, but store the jar slightly on an angle in the freezer so that the expansion can go towards the lid as opposed to being stuck perfectly horizontal and cracking the jar. So just store the jar on a slight angle in the freezer as it freezes, and you shouldn't have any troubles. Fingers crossed. All right, now, in terms of filling these up, if you're using silicone, silicone doesn't hold its shape very easily. So I'd like to just get a little cutting board or something that I can keep these on and put them on there before you fill them. Just speaking from past experience there. Okay, so nothing too complicated there. Once the liquid is cool enough for you to work with, I like to use a little thing with a pouring spout just to make this life a bit easier, this job a bit easier. And we'll just top them up and pop them in the freezer. As soon as they're frozen, pop them out, put them into a different container so that we can continue freezing until all of that is safely stored. And there we have it. Okay, so what are the other uses that we can use? I'm going to show you this trick as well. What are the other uses that we can use bone broth for? Or sorry, even veggie stock for? Any of these flavorful ingredients. So we talked about the breakfast eggs, the poached breakfast eggs. It's a lot easier than you think, so I'd love for you to give that one a go. And otherwise, soups. Soups is probably the most obvious one. If soups are not already a staple in your world, then this is actually part of a sort of 3-part mini series. And we're going to show you how to make a particular soup, the Italian soup, next week with this broth that now you have in the freezer. And so in soups, otherwise, when I'm cooking rice, it's so much more flavorful and delicious if we can cook it with a little bit of broth or stock instead of just plain water. Doesn't have to be entirely stock, but definitely we can top that up with water. Cooking quinoa, cooking buckwheat, even making stir-fry sauces out of, or adding a little bit of extra flavor, even just having it as a hot drink on its own. Okay, so keeping in mind, actually one of my favorite ways to have a hot drink, I actually take a mug, a little bit of miso paste, I kind of smear it on the inside of the mug so there's no chunky bits, and pour the hot broth into that, and that is a delicious hot drink on its own instead of a cup of tea. There's lots of uses. I'm sure you'll find other uses for this as well. Pretty much anything savory. It's amazing to include a little bit of this in baby food. If you're making your own blended purees and baby food, put a little bit of that in as the liquid instead of water. In mashed potatoes, oh my goodness, delicious flavor added to mashed potatoes or mashed sweet potato. Mashed celeriac, as you saw the celeriac before. So many uses to get that extra bit of vitamins and minerals. So as I mentioned, the bone broth is going to be covered in a separate topic. And again, I'm sorry you don't get smell-o-vision tonight, but would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts on the broth tomorrow morning when you get that. And love to hear how that goes. And any other use ideas, please engage, share your ideas. You might have some other amazing idea on how you use your broth that we haven't mentioned here. As a matter of fact, now that I think about that, thinking of someone that did send me an idea previously, she turns these into little bone broth or veggie broth jellies for her little ones who just devour them. So it's kind of like you're having Jello, but there's no sugar. There's kind of savory jellies, and they just love playing with them and eating them. So that's another little side option as well. And other than that, that's how easy it is to make broth part of your world. So please give it a go, have a try. Your first one may not be perfect. It may be a little bit bitter. Doesn't matter. Do it again and make use of all those extra dollars that would have otherwise been going in the bin, please. So send me your questions. If you have any other things that are not clear, let's cover them. Let's make sure this is something that you can make happen in your world. Thank you for coming to cook with me, and I can't wait to see your broth photos very soon.